On a sunny day in August 2015, Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, was busy doing this. No, don't rub your eyes. He really is tossing a load of big black balls into a lake. How many big black balls? Well, by the time Garcetti had finished throwing in that batch, the total number clogging up the lake stood at a whopping 96 million. So what exactly was he thinking? Maybe he was creating a giant black ball pit? Or trying to hide something beneath them? Whatever it is, it doesn't exactly look like the most environmentally friendly activity. Intrigued? Well, get ready as we take a deep dive into why 96 million balls were dumped into this Los Angeles lake. To start our story off, first we've got to find out what and where Eric Garcetti was throwing those balls into. The mayor was standing on the banks of Los Angeles' Van Norman Reservoir, also known simply as the Los Angeles Reservoir. This basin, found in Sylmar, the most northern neighborhood in Los Angeles, stretches 2/3 of a mile long and nearly half a mile across. In terms of overall size, the reservoir takes up a grand total of 175 acres. For context, that's over 130 times the size of a football field. But how much water can it hold exactly? Well, only some 3.3 billion gallons of the stuff. That's enough to fill some 5,000 Olympic swimming pools. The Los Angeles Reservoir has enough water to supply the city with 3 weeks' worth of drinking water if the city's other resources fail, providing an important backstop in the city's water supply. Considering just how important this reservoir is, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, or LADWP, must have been fearing the worst when a devastating drought hit the region back in 2011. The dry period was attributed to a ridge of high pressure in the Pacific Sea, known as the Ridiculously Resilient Ridge, which prevented winter storms from reaching California. As a result, less rainfall reached the area, with a 50% drop in precipitation from 2011 to 2012. To make things even more unbearable, the drought didn't stop after a few months. It lasted for years. 2014 ended as California's driest and warmest since records began in 1895, while in 2015 the state experienced its second driest and second warmest year on record. The following year, in 2016, conditions were so unbearable that some 62 million trees died in California alone. So you get just how bad this was. Unsurprisingly, that long-lasting drought wasn't good news for Los Angeles' water levels. Due to the drop in precipitation, less water ended up in rivers and streams, and so less water ended up in the Los Angeles Reservoir. On top of that, the hot, dry conditions during this time also increased evaporation in bodies of water, which lowered the water levels even more. Nowhere was that more obvious than at the reservoir. Whoa, what's this? It's only our brand new, fun and frantic trivia card game we've been developing for years. We've packed it full of all our most interesting facts, and whenever another player thinks you're wrong, they can cut you off with a catastrophic nuh-uh. Steal your opponent's cards and risk your own and nuh-uh. And if trivia isn't your strong suit, don't worry. All the questions in nuh-uh are multiple choice, meaning eggheads and non-eggheads alike stand a chance. Crazy game-altering powers like switcheroo, flip-flop, and piggyback add extra layers of strategy, deception, and chaos to the experience. We've toiled playtesting and tweaking nuh-uh for countless hours, and each and every game was its own fun, wacky adventure. Oh, and we've designed and printed it to perfection. Look, that's me on the box over there. So, what are you waiting for? Instead of tolerating dry conversation this Thanksgiving with your know-it-all Uncle Kev, put him in his place with a well-timed nuh-uh. This Black Friday, you can get the base game and the Science and Nature expansion pack, adding over 200 more questions for only $25. That's a whopping 25% discount for our quickest, most loyal fans over Black Friday only. Click the link in the description or on screen now to order your copy today. Nuh-uh makes an excellent gift this Thanksgiving. Our stock is limited, so order now while supplies last. Okay, now let's get back to your regularly scheduled programming. So the LA reservoir was rapidly evaporating due to the dry heat, and things were so severe it was losing an estimated 300 million gallons of water each year. That's more than 450 Olympic swimming pools. Yeah, this means the reservoir was losing more than Olympic swimming pools worth of water every single day to evaporation. God, the humidity in that area must have been unbearable. But this historically dangerous drought wasn't the only problem. Bromide is a naturally occurring element found in salt water. On its own, it's harmless to humans, but it doesn't stay that way. The Los Angeles reservoir, like many others, disinfects its water with a chlorine solution, making it safe for human consumption. However, when chlorine is mixed with bromide, a nasty reaction takes place, turning the harmless bromide elements into a much more sinister chemical compound called bromate. Bromate is a carcinogenic element, meaning that exposure to large amounts of the stuff can cause cancer. If that wasn't scary enough, people who ingest large amounts of bromate may suffer from various gastrointestinal problems like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and abdominal pain. In some cases, individuals can even experience kidney problems and hearing loss. So this really isn't something you want in your water. Understandably, the LADWP were keeping a close eye on bromate levels in all their reservoirs. And much to their dread, the levels of the carcinogen compound in them kept spiking. Generally, water suppliers must keep bromate levels to a level below 10 parts per billion. But at the nearby Elysian Reservoir back in 2007, bromate spiked to levels of 106 parts per billion. That's over 10 times the maximum recommended concentration. Presumably, bromate levels at the Los Angeles reservoir reached similarly scary heights. So, what was causing these uncontrollable spikes? As it happens, sunlight turbocharges this reaction, sending the bromate levels in the reservoir through the roof. This left the LADWP with a difficult decision. Their water source contained bromide, which they couldn't easily remove, and the water has to be chlorinated to make it safe for use. So the only option they had left was to remove the sunlight. While it's easy enough to block out the sun when you're indoors, it's not such a simple task when you've got to cover an area of 175 acres. Initially, it was thought that a large floating tarp cover could protect the reservoir from those sun rays, but making a tarp some half a mile wide just isn't feasible. That project would be way too expensive, time-consuming, and, from a physical standpoint, impossible. An alternative method was suggested, which involved splitting the reservoir in two with a bisecting dam. That way, two floating covers could be installed more manageably, yet even then, this would cost a tear-jerking $300 million. Yep, safe to say it didn't take long for that idea to be crossed off the list. Okay, so floating covers may have been optimistic, but the LADWP weren't finished there. They then came up with the idea of laying lots of high-density polyethylene pipes onto the reservoir. The thinking was the pipes would float on the water's surface, creating some protection from the sun. The problem was, having enough pipes to cover such a sizable body of water is both impractical and pricey. So despite plenty of plans and endless hours of meetings, the LADWP still couldn't find a solution to their water worries. Man, who knew covering some water would be such ball-breaking work? But speaking of balls, that leads us to the final proposal. After each plan fell flat on its face because of the cost and scale, a saving grace was found: the shade ball. Now I know what you're thinking. What the heck are shade balls? Maybe some kind of rare Pokeball? Or even some dark derivation of baseball that somehow you've never come across? Well, sorry to disappoint, but in reality, shade balls are simply these plastic air-filled black spheres. Originally known as bird balls, these things were developed for the mining industry, where they were used to prevent birds from landing on toxic tailing ponds. From there, these bizarre balls were used at ponds near airport runways with the aim of deterring birds from the area, preventing them being minced by any airplane jet engines. Then, Brian White, a retired LADWP biologist, came up with the ingenious idea to use these bird balls for something else. He proposed for their use at reservoirs in Los Angeles, not to prevent birds from landing on the water, but to protect the fluid from the sunlight. Effectively, shade balls, or bird balls as they were then known, were a malleable cover that could be dumped onto the water's surface, helping to decrease both water evaporation and bromate spikes. In 2008, Brian's bright idea got the go-ahead, leading to 400,000 shade balls being dashed onto the Ivanhoe Reservoir in northern Los Angeles with the primary aim of preventing bromate buildup. Clearly, it caught on. Before long, two other Los Angeles reservoirs, Elysian and Upper Stone Canyon, also got their share of shade balls. But it wasn't until 2015, 7 years after they were dumped into the Ivanhoe Reservoir, that the Los Angeles Reservoir gave this curious cover a chance. And it's fair to say they more than made up for any lost time. In August of that year, Los Angeles Mayor Eric Garcetti supervised the final load of shade balls being dumped into the reservoir. That final batch of 20,000 balls brought the total covering the Los Angeles Reservoir to a staggering 96 million. I mean, can you imagine how long it took to dump all 96 million balls into a reservoir? And with every inch of the water surface area covered, imagine taking a plunge in that water. You wouldn't be able to move. Heck, even driving a boat through this reservoir would be next to impossible. To get a feel of just how many balls were dumped into this reservoir, let me put it into context for you. If you were to count each one of these 96 million shade balls, let's say one ball a second, it'd take you over 3 years until you tallied up every last one. Man alive, that's a lot of balls. While that's all well and good, the thing everyone really wants to know is if these things actually worked. Well, to explain, let's first take a deeper dive into what we're actually dealing with. Each one of the 96 million shade balls measures around 4 inches in diameter, making them slightly larger than a baseball. In terms of weight, they stack up at just under 1.5 ounces, which, if you're wondering, is roughly a third of the weight of a baseball. For that reason, each and every one of the shade balls is partially filled with water, taking them to a heftier 8-ounce weight bracket, preventing them from blowing away in the wind. And that's pretty important considering they're designed to sit on the reservoir's surface and cast shade by, well, just staying there. Now, you may be wondering why exactly shade balls are coated black. After all, wouldn't their dark color absorb more sunlight, forming a thermal blanket that'll only help to speed up water evaporation at the reservoir? But funnily enough, the ball's dark hue is actually a measure to reduce evaporation. Now, the shade balls do absorb a lot of energy, getting hotter on the areas directly in the sunlight. However, as the balls are filled mostly with air, they're good thermal insulators, meaning very little heat is transferred from the balls to the water below. On the other hand, if the shade balls were white, they wouldn't absorb the sunlight, but reflect it, allowing more light in the gaps between the balls, and as a result allowing more light to hit the reservoir. Man, those balls are brilliant. If that wasn't enough, shade balls are also dirt cheap. One of these balls costs just 36 cents. Obviously, when you order 96 million, that bill isn't looking quite so measly. Added up, the total cost of all shade balls was over $34 million. Now, I know that sounds like a lot, but considering the LADWP were considering forking out $300 million to fix their reservoir riddle, I'd say those shade balls at around a tenth of that price are a steal. On top of that, each shade ball is estimated to have a lifespan of around 10 years before needing to be replaced. That works out at a cost of just $3.4 million per year to protect the reservoir. That's a bargain. Okay, being cheap is all well and good, but we've still got to get to the crux of the matter. How effective were the shade balls at actually helping preserve the reservoir? Well, studies conducted on shade balls report that they reduce evaporation by 85 to 90%. That equates to saving close to 300 million gallons of water every year, enough to provide drinking water for 8,100 people. More importantly, the shade provided by those millions of balls prevented sunlight from hitting the water and kick-starting the reaction that spiked bromate levels. While no figures have been released by the LADWP on the success of shade balls in limiting bromate levels in the LA reservoir, the shade ball's ability to lower evaporation levels means less sunlight is hitting the water. And as you're now well aware, less sunlight equals less bromate. So these 96 million shade balls reduced both evaporation and most likely bromate levels in the LA reservoir, providing safer water for millions of residents. And at a cheap price, relatively speaking. Sounds too good to be true, right? And that's because it was. Yep, nothing in life comes easy. And yes, that's even true when we're talking about shade balls. Firstly, these things may have some pretty nasty effects on the environment. I mean, on the face of it, shoving 96 million plastic balls into a reservoir doesn't sound like the most climate-friendly activity. While each ball is made from high-density polyethylene, a fairly safe plastic, the stuff still isn't fault-proof. Over time, plastic degrades, especially when exposed to water and the baking hot sun. As a result, the shade balls leach, releasing microplastics into the water supply. Most plastics found in our water supplies around the world start off as typical objects like plastic bags, wrappers, water bottles, or even shade balls. Yet over time, the plastic fragment into tiny microplastics. In fact, over 90% of the more than 5 trillion plastic pieces floating on the surface of the world's oceans are smaller than a grain of rice. And what's worse, the plastic takes hundreds of years to break down. In aquatic invertebrates, ingesting microplastics causes a decline in feeding behavior and fertility. In fish, microplastics can cause damage to intestines, liver, gills, and the brain. Us humans aren't unaffected either. It's reported that inhalation of microplastics can lead to respiratory problems, as well as fatigue and dizziness due to a low blood oxygen concentration. So, can you imagine the potential microplastics released by some 96 million shade balls? Not sounding so great now, are they? But that's not the only drawback. A research study published shortly after the shade balls were dumped into the LA reservoir revealed these spheres may actually use up more water than they save. Wait, how does that work? Well, shade balls have to be made in the first place, and this requires oil, gas, and electricity to produce, all of which needs large amounts of water. It's estimated that producing 96 million 4-inch shade balls would have used over 700 million gallons of water, more than double the amount that the shade balls were projected to save from evaporation each year. Saying that, it's not all doom and gloom. If the shade balls were to last the 10 years that they're said to and save 300 million gallons of water each year, by the time they're done with, they'll have saved 3 billion gallons of water. For reference, that's more than 4 times the amount of water it took to manufacture them in the first place. So while producing shade balls with masses of water seems counterproductive initially, these do technically make up for that loss in just over 2 years of their 10-year lifespan. Despite that, the negative effects of shade balls have been too much for some. By the end of 2015, the other 3 LA-based shade supporters all had their balls removed. Wait, not like that. Ivanhoe Reservoir was going out of service, so the shade balls were obviously no longer needed. As for the Elysian and Upper Stone Canyon reservoirs, well, they opted for a standing floating cover in place of the shade balls. Unfortunately, as we've already seen, things could never be that easy for the Los Angeles Reservoir, with a floating cover costing some $300 million. The much cheaper shade balls offered a mid-term, cost-effective compromise. For some, though, the black ball cover is really just a cheap way of avoiding getting into hot water. No pun intended. Let me explain. Back in 2006, the Environmental Protection Agency's long-term 2 enhanced surface water treatment rule announced that open-air reservoirs in the U.S. holding treated water had to be covered. Some skeptics believe those black balls aren't really there to prevent evaporation or bromate buildup, but to stay in compliance with the Environmental Protection Agency's policy. What do you reckon? Is this a genuine attempt to boost Los Angeles' water quality, or a cheap cop-out to avoid breaking the Environmental Protection Agency's policy? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. Either way, you won't be surprised to know that Los Angeles isn't the only place in the world that's experienced water worries. All around the globe, there are some weird and wonderful water covers designed to keep the sun away. Over in South Australia, summer temperatures can climb above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So, in an attempt to ease water loss, the company AG Floats came up with their own peculiar protection product. Take a look at this. Yep, that's right. These guys are using recycled tires to protect large bodies of water from sunlight. Saying that, have they not considered the fact tires have got a big round chunk missing from their middle? Fair to say those don't look like the best sun blockers. As well as that, AG Floats have also encountered the pesky problem that, when exposed to sunlight, their protective product will degrade, sending harmful residue into the water system. Any green fingers watching will be glad to know there are some more eco methods out there too. Floating aquatic plants like water lilies, duckweed, and water meal are helpful at reducing the evaporation of water reservoirs by covering the water surface, providing a layer of protection between air and the water surface. Though it may sound good in practice, floating plants only reduce evaporation rates by up to 10%, making them 80% less effective than those trusty old shade balls. As well as that, aquatic plants can lead to excessive algae growth, and considering drinking algae-affected water can induce vomiting, diarrhea, fevers, and headaches, that's probably not something you want to be chugging down. Yeah, fair to say this whole water covering work is no walk in the park. Yet for all these weird and wonderful methods, as well as the hundreds of millions of dollars spent on creating the perfect cover to shade water from the Los Angeles reservoir, there may be an even better solution out there. Presumably, this would be the product of a high-tech lab scientist or some world-famous university lecturer. Well, not quite. Instead, it was the work of a 10th grader. Yep, unbelievable as it sounds, Kenneth West from Melbourne High School, Florida, put forward his own ingenious idea. After hearing about the shade balls, Kenneth realized that the balls, even when packed at their tightest, still exposed up to 10% of the water's surface to the elements, increasing both evaporation and bromate levels. So, Kenneth, being the whiz he is, had a eureka moment. What if there was another shape that could cover the water surface more compactly? And that brought him to the dodecahedron, a 12-sided dice-like shape. Kenneth's thinking was that these shapes, due to their pentagon faces, would perfectly interlock with one another, forming a smooth seal over the water. So to test his theory, our board Kenneth set up an experiment. He placed 12 bins in his yard and filled each with water. He then covered the water in 4 of the bins with layer of standard shade balls. In another 4 bins, he instead used the new shade dodecahedrons. And finally, in the last 4 bins, he left the water completely exposed. Then, after 10 days, Kenneth returned to his yard to assess the results. The bins with no cover lost 53% of their water to evaporation on average. Bins that used shade balls fared much better, losing just 36% of their water. And last but not least, bins that used dodecahedron lost, drumroll please, less than 1% of their water. Yep, thanks to their perfectly packed design, the shade dodecahedrons provide an almost perfect cover for the water, reducing evaporation by a staggering 99%. So, could this be an answer for LA's reservoirs? While Elysian and Upper Stone Canyon reservoirs opted for floating covers and the LA reservoir continues to persist with its millions of shade balls, perhaps the perfect solution is those trusty shade dodecahedrons. I mean, they reduce evaporation by 99%, so these mini miracles will save almost a fifth more water compared to shade balls. Plus, as shade dodecahedrons would still cover the reservoir, they'd comply with the Environmental Protection Agency's long-term 2 enhanced surface water treatment rule. What's not to like? Los Angeles, I think I've just found the solution to your water woes. Man, and to think that all came from the brain of a 10th grader. Jeez, when I was his age, I was busy playing on my Game Boy and thinking about homework. And to think I could have been solving a global water crisis. Despite the fact that more efficient alternatives have been created, multiple places around the world still opt for the use of shade balls. Take Yorkshire Water in England, for example. While England is pretty notorious for its abundance of rain, these balls aren't used to keep water from evaporating. In this case, the balls are still used as bird balls, and as you can see, they perfectly disguise the water surface so that birds don't land on it, while keeping the water beneath fit for purpose. So they might not be the most efficient solution, and they may still need to be replaced, but you can't deny that watching them being poured into a lake like this scratches an itch you didn't know you had. Well, that rounds up our deep dive into everything shade ball. What do you think of the idea? Is it a good solution? Or can you think of an alternative option? Either way, let me know down in the comments below, and thanks for watching.